There's a peculiar silence that follows a moment of profound realization. A silence not born from peace but from the sudden fracture between the world you once knew and the one you now see with terrifying clarity. This is the burden of knowledge. It's often said that knowledge is power, but that's only half the truth. What they don't tell you is that knowledge is also exile. The more deeply you understand the world, its illusions, its hypocrisies, its hidden systems, the more you drift from it. The pursuit of truth, once romanticized as noble and heroic, often feels like walking deeper into a forest that others pretend doesn't exist. Friedrich Nietzsche knew this. He famously warned, "And if you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you." What happens when you stop merely looking at the world and begin to see through it? Nietzsche himself spent much of his life in solitude, wrestling with truths that few dared to confront. He dismantled morality, questioned the very foundations of meaning, and foresaw a world adrift without God or objective truth. But this enlightenment came at a cost. Alienated from society, misunderstood by peers, and ultimately descending into madness, Nietzsche became the embodiment of the solitary philosopher, whose mind outpaced the comfort of belonging. He wasn't alone. Arthur Schopenhauer, who inspired Nietzsche, wrote about the deep loneliness of the thinking individual. "A man can be himself only so long as he is alone," he declared. For both men, knowledge was not just illumination, it was isolation. And in that isolation, a paradox emerged. To see more clearly is to stand more alone. Why is it that truth distances rather than connects? Why does deeper understanding often feel like losing something rather than gaining? Perhaps because the world we inherit, its social norms, its values, its institutions, is designed to be lived in, not questioned. When we pull back the curtain, we don't just expose the lie, we expose ourselves to a reality that others are not ready or willing to acknowledge. And once you see, you can't unsee. The mind that awakens is the mind that wanders. So we must ask, is enlightenment a gift of insight or a curse of separation? Does understanding liberate us, or does it imprison us in a world we can no longer truly belong to? That's where our journey begins, not with an answer, but with a haunting question. A question that countless minds, both past and present, have asked in silence. What if the more you wake up, the more alone you become? Throughout history, the search for truth has often demanded a sacrifice, not just of comfort or safety, but of belonging. Those who dared to think differently, who pulled at the threads of the world's tightly woven illusions, often found themselves cast out, ridiculed, or worse, destroyed by the very societies they sought to illuminate. Socrates is perhaps the most haunting example. In ancient Athens, he wandered the streets asking questions that cut deeper than anyone was willing to admit. He didn't offer answers, he dismantled assumptions. His method, now celebrated as the Socratic method, was seen then as subversive, even dangerous. He challenged the gods of the city, exposed the ignorance of its leaders, and forced ordinary citizens to confront the contradictions in their own beliefs. But the price of his intellectual honesty was death. Condemned for corrupting the youth and impiety, Socrates chose to drink hemlock rather than flee or recant. His final words were to his friend, "We owe a rooster to Asclepius, a thank you, perhaps, to the god of healing." For death, to Socrates, was not a defeat, but a cure for the illness of ignorance he saw consuming the world around him. He died not because he was wrong, but because he was to write for the comfort of those in power. Centuries later, Galileo Galilei stared through his telescope and saw moons orbiting Jupiter, clear evidence that the Earth was not the center of the universe, but the Church, whose authority rested on a cosmology with Earth and man at its heart, was not prepared for such heresy. Galileo was summoned before the Inquisition, forced to recant his findings under threat of torture. Though he whispered, "and yet it moves," under his breath, he spent the rest of his life under house arrest, a prisoner of knowledge. Galileo's case was not just about science versus religion. It was about power versus truth. The institutions built on centuries of unquestioned belief could not afford a single fracture. Enlightenment, to them, was not progress, it was an existential threat. And so, as with Socrates, the punishment was not for being incorrect, but for being disruptive, for refusing to lie to oneself for the sake of harmony. René Descartes took a different path, one not of confrontation, but of introspection. Tormented by doubt, Descartes began his philosophical journey by questioning everything. What if the senses deceive us? What if the external world is an illusion? His famous declaration, cogito, ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, was not a proud conclusion, but a desperate anchor in a sea of uncertainty. Descartes' commitment to rational clarity left him intellectually isolated, caught between the skepticism of science and the dogma of religion. Though he avoided the fate of Socrates or Galileo, Descartes paid his own price. He lived in exile, in constant fear of religious persecution, moving from place to place with his manuscripts and doubts. His was not a martyrdom of the body, but of the soul, a restless existence. Between knowing too much and belonging to little. This is the recurring tragedy of the enlightened mind in history. Each of these figures, Socrates, Galileo, Descartes, stood at the edges of their civilizations, looking inward, shouting truths into a silence that quickly turned hostile. Their lives illustrate a chilling reality. Society rewards conformity, not clarity. Those who awaken from the dream of consensus are often treated as threats, not visionaries. Why? Because truth, real truth, is destabilizing. It calls into question the foundations of systems, religious, political, cultural, that depend on belief, not understanding. When someone speaks a truth that reveals the artificial nature of those systems, the system defends itself, not through reasoned debate, but through suppression. The outsider, then, becomes both a symbol and a scapegoat, admired in retrospect, demonized in their time. Even in the modern era, the pattern persists. Alan Turing, the father of modern computing, broke Nazi codes during World War II and helped end one of the darkest chapters in human history. Yet, because of his homosexuality, illegal in 1950s Britain, he was chemically castrated. By the very state he served, he died in disgrace, only to be celebrated decades later when the social tides had changed. His intellectual gifts made him indispensable, but his difference made him disposable. The Enlightenment thinkers of the 18th century, like Voltaire, Diderot, and Rousseau, all faced censorship, exile, or imprisonment. Their ideas on liberty, secularism, and reason were explosive to monarchies built on divine right and unchallenged authority. Their pursuit of truth did not begin revolutions because it was beautiful. It did so because it was dangerous. The truth teller, historically, is not a beloved figure. He or she is often feared. And when the ideas finally take hold, when the revolution arrives or the paradigm shifts, the thinkers who sowed the seeds are rarely round to enjoy the fruits. Their reward is not applause, but alienation. This is the price of awakening. Not everyone who questions is destroyed, but everyone who awakens walks further away from the crowd. They begin to notice things others don't. They speak a language that sounds strange to those still wrapped in comforting illusions. They are not better than others, but they are lonelier. For enlightenment does not elevate one above society. It often removes one from it. And it is here that we find the archetype of the outsider, not the rebel without cause, but the thinker, who sees too much, too clearly. They are not cynical, they are burdened with clarity. They are not antisocial, they are disillusioned by the surface of things. They long not to dominate others, but to be understood. And in that longing, they are often left unheard. The journey of intellectual awakening, then, is not just a path toward truth. It is a departure from community, from comfort, from belonging. It asks not just what you're willing to learn, but what you're willing to lose. So we must ask ourselves, if awakening costs us the very world we seek to understand, is the price still worth it? Or does the true tragedy lie not in being wrong, but in being right when the world isn't ready to listen? The deeper you go in understanding, the quieter it gets. There's a kind of silence that surrounds the mind. Once it begins to see beyond the surface of things, a silence not of peace, but of distance. As if every layer of truth peeled back comes with the cost of one more layer of connection lost. This is not just philosophical, it's deeply psychological. Carl Jung spoke of individuation, the process by which one becomes truly themselves, distinct from the collective unconscious. He described it as a path filled with difficulty and loneliness, not because it is unnatural, but because so few ever walk it. Most people, Jung believed, are content to remain in the tribal identity of the social self, where approval and comfort are traded for authenticity. But for those who begin to question, who feel the stirrings of something deeper, a separation begins. It's the realization that the world most people live in is not necessarily the real one, but a shared hallucination, a consensus reality built on convenience, cultural inertia, and emotional safety. And once that realization takes hold, it becomes harder to engage in the same conversations, the same distractions, the same rituals. It's not superiority, it's incompatibility. Like trying to explain color to someone who's only seen in black and white. You aren't angry they don't understand, you just feel profoundly alone in what you now see. This is existential isolation. The idea that no matter how deeply connected we feel to others, there is a fundamental solitude to the human experience, a space within us that no one else can fully access. For most people, this solitude is quieted by shared beliefs, routines, entertainment, religion, or social engagement. But for the enlightened mind, one that has dismantled many of those structures, this isolation becomes stark. Erik Erikson, a pioneer of human development, identified one of the key challenges of adulthood as intimacy versus isolation. It's the tension between wanting to be known and fearing that one's true self is too different to be accepted. For those on a path of intense intellectual or philosophical self-exploration, this tension can become a source of quiet despair. You crave connection, but not the superficial kind. You want to be seen, not just looked at, understood, not just heard. But the more you know, the more you understand about history, power, manipulation, psychology, illusion, the fewer people there are who can meet you in that depth. And so, like a diver returning to the surface after exploring the ocean floor, you find the air above has thinned. You can no longer breathe where you once thrived. The American existential psychologist Rollo May called this the loss of innocence, a psychological stage in which a person's worldview is permanently altered by experience or insight. It's not that the world has changed, it's that your perception has, and the comfort of certainty is replaced with the burden of seeing too much and feeling too little comfort in it. And then comes the dark night of the soul, a term popularized by mystics and psychologists alike. It describes a period of deep psychological or spiritual crisis, a collapsing of meaning. The dark night isn't just sadness, it's a confrontation with the void, a realization that everything you once believed might be incomplete, or worse, an illusion. This dark night often follows intense periods of intellectual awakening. It's the psychic cost of enlightenment. You awaken not into bliss but into a kind of internal exile. You see how society functions, how people are manipulated, how fear drives behavior, how illusions are protected, and yet you are powerless to change it. Worse, you realize that most don't even want it to change. So you ask yourself, is ignorance truly bliss? From a psychological perspective, the answer might be yes. Cognitive dissonance, the discomfort one feels when holding to contradictory beliefs, explains why people cling so tightly to illusions. They protect mental stability. Knowing the truth might be noble, but it is not necessarily healthy in the conventional sense. Comfort often lies in conformity, in shared delusions that keep people feeling safe and oriented. When those illusions collapse, there is no immediate reward, only questions and more questions. And yet, we're wired to seek meaning. Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor and psychiatrist, wrote that humans can endure almost any suffering so long as they believe it has meaning. But for the awakened mind, meaning itself becomes suspect. Is it constructed, inherited, earned? Or is it something we invent just to keep the darkness at bay? This creates a profound tension, the desire to connect, to belong, to feel joy versus the awareness that these states are often built on foundations that no longer feel real. The result is a kind of emotional vertigo. You crave the world, yet recoil from its illusions. You long for people, but struggle to communicate with those still living inside the dream you've stepped out of. And so, the enlightened mind becomes, in many ways, a liminal figure, someone caught between two worlds, the one they used to believe in and the one they now see, neither fully part of society nor fully detached from it. It's not a rejection of humanity, but a tragic love for it, a grief for what it could be and sorrow for what it is. This isolation isn't always visible. Many who experience it learn to mask it, to play the social game while feeling like a stranger within it. They laugh when expected, make small talk, share pleasantries, yet deep down, there's a lingering sense of being out of sync, like a character who has read the final chapter of a book everyone else is still beginning. And this raises the most haunting question: can the enlightened mind ever truly be happy? In a world of ordinary consciousness, happiness, for many, is rooted in simplicity, in having answers, not questions, in believing in things without dissecting them. But the enlightened mind lives in the space between paradoxes. It knows that joy is fleeting, that meaning is fragile, that people lie even to themselves. But perhaps there is another kind of happiness, not the shallow kind built on ignorance, but a deeper, quieter form, contentment in truth, even when it isolates, purpose and observation, even without participation, compassion for those still asleep, rather than resentment for their slumber. The journey is not about escaping isolation. It's about learning to sit with it, to see it not as a curse, but as a necessary companion to awareness. For in that solitude, something else can emerge, not despair, but clarity, not arrogance, but humility. And from that place, maybe, just maybe, connection is still possible, not with everyone, but with those few who have also walked into the silence and stayed. There is a strange and silent burden that comes with seeing the world clearly. It doesn't arrive with fanfare or applause. It doesn't bring peace or satisfaction. Instead, it brings a quiet, almost unbearable weight, a burden that those around you can't see and that you can't unsee. Because once you begin to perceive the machinery beneath the surface, the systems of control, the subtle manipulations, the invisible architecture of belief, you no longer live in the same world as everyone else. You live in the real one, and the real world, stripped of its illusions, is not kind. It is not noble. It is not fair. It is a place where fear governs behavior, where institutions preserve themselves through deceit, and where the collective will often favors comfort over truth. This realization is not hypothetical. It is psychological. Social psychologists have long studied the mechanisms by which human beings are conditioned to conform, to obey, and to rationalize. The experiments of Solomon Asch showed how people will deny the evidence of their own eyes, simply to fit in. Stanley Milgram's obedience studies revealed that ordinary people, under the right conditions, will inflict harm on others if instructed by an authority figure. Philip Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment demonstrated how quickly the roles of guard and prisoner consume the individual. In each case, the same theme emerges: the human mind is fragile and frighteningly obedient. To see this clearly is to understand how susceptible the masses are to manipulation, not because they are stupid, but because they are human. It is built into the psyche, the desire to belong, to avoid cognitive dissonance, to make sense of chaos with simple stories. And so propaganda works not because it is sophisticated, but because it is familiar. It speaks to the part of the brain that craves certainty. It weaponizes emotion, especially fear, and once fear takes hold, logic recedes. As Edward Bernays, the father of public relations, once said, the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. He wasn't warning us, he was celebrating it. This is the world the enlightened mind wakes up to, a world not of accidental chaos, but of engineered control. Media outlets that shape narratives rather than report them, education systems that teach obedience over curiosity, political discourse designed to divide rather than unite, cultural rituals that serve corporations more than communities. And the more you see, the more alone you become, not because others reject you, but because they don't see what you see. They still believe the shadows on the wall are real. They still cheer for the illusion, still argue over false choices, still place hope in broken systems. You try to speak, you try to explain, but your words sound paranoid, cynical, conspiratorial even when they are supported by evidence, because the truth, once it contradicts someone's worldview, feels like an attack, and people do not defend their beliefs with reason. They defend them with identity. This is the burden of perception, to see clearly in a world that demands blindness. George Orwell warned us about a future of overt oppression where language would be twisted, history erased, and surveillance normalized. Aldous Huxley, on the other hand, envisioned a world where truth would be drowned in a sea of irrelevance, where people would be pacified by pleasure, and censorship would be unnecessary because no one cared to read. Both were right. We live in the overlap of their visions, a society where distraction is a weapon, and where the real horrors are hidden not behind barbed wire, but beneath layers of entertainment, convenience, and cultural programming. And for the enlightened mind, this creates a maddening paradox. You know what's happening, but you can't stop it. You see how fear is used to control the population. You see how outrage is manufactured to divide it. You see how economic systems exploit under the banner of freedom, how war is sanitized and sold, how lies are repeated until they become truth. But what can you do? Shout into the void. Watch as people scroll past your warnings, call you dramatic, or worse, dangerous. This helplessness is its own kind of suffering, not the pain of ignorance, but the agony of knowledge without power, like a doctor diagnosing a terminal disease in a patient who refuses to believe they're sick. You carry the diagnosis, but no one will take the medicine. And so, frustration builds, not at individuals, but at the system itself, at the scale of it, the genius of it, the way it adapts, absorbs, evolves, the way every revolution becomes a brand, every rebellion a product. You realize that the machine doesn't just resist change, it consumes it, repackages it, and sells it back to the public as lifestyle. You begin to see the absurdity of it all, the rituals, the news cycles, the arguments, the hashtags, the pageantry of outrage, the theater of choice. It all becomes a surreal performance, an elaborate dance of distraction that keeps people busy while the gears of power turn silently in the background. And you ask yourself, is this what it means to be awake? To live in a state of permanent exile from consensus reality, to carry truths that cannot be spoken because they shatter too many illusions. It's not nihilism that follows, it's not despair, it's something quieter, a kind of weary clarity, a recognition that, perhaps, the world doesn't want to be saved, that maybe deep down, people prefer the comfort of illusion, that truth, for most, is a burden they never asked to bear. But still, you bear it, because to return to ignorance would be worse, because once the veil is lifted, there is no unseeing, and in that space, in that loneliness, a new kind of strength is born. Not the strength to change the world overnight, but to live within it, without becoming part of its deception. The burden of perception is heavy, but it is also the beginning of something rare. Integrity. You may not change the world, but you will not lie to yourself about it. And that, in a world built on deception, is a radical act. There is a strange irony that lives at the heart of enlightenment. The deeper one's understanding becomes of themselves, of the world, of reality, the more splintered the experience of existence grows. It's not a singular journey, but a dual one. A constant tug-of-war between internal clarity and external disconnection, between the serenity of self-awareness and the ache of social detachment. To awaken is not merely to know more, it is to see more about who you are, about who others are, and about the illusions that cradle everyday life. But with that sight comes a splitting, a duality of being that can never fully be reconciled. On one side stands the self-reflective mind, grounded, aware, awake. It sees its own patterns and wounds with new depth. It uncovers motives once buried, behaviors once automatic. It peels away the conditioning inherited from childhood, from culture, from trauma. And in that excavation, it often finds something closer to the authentic self, the part of you untouched by the roles you were assigned. The self-reflective awakening is powerful. It brings a sense of internal coherence, a connection to purpose, a clarity of identity. You no longer react blindly. You choose, you understand, you become. But on the other side of this enlightenment stands the shadow, and not just the one Jung spoke of as the repressed aspects of the self, but a broader shadow, the weight of separation. For while you may have found yourself, you have also lost something else, the comfort of belonging. Because in seeing clearly, you can no longer pretend. You no longer fit cleanly into family roles, into cultural expectations. into surface-level conversations. The jokes that once made you laugh now feel hollow. The traditions that once brought warmth feel artificial. Even the people you once loved, though still cherished, seem like strangers at times. Not because they've changed, but because you have. This is the wound of the awakened, to long for connection, yet struggle to participate in a world that seems to run on illusions you can no longer accept. And yet, the need for connection doesn't disappear. It remains embedded in our biology, in our nervous systems, in our emotional blueprint. To be human is to crave intimacy. To be enlightened is to find that intimacy harder to reach. So you live into worlds, the internal world of insight, wisdom, and reflection, and the external world of misunderstanding, misalignment, and distance. Sometimes, you feel like a translator, trying to express truths that others haven't yet touched, hoping your words will bridge the gap. Other times, you feel like a ghost, watching life unfold through glass, unable to participate without betraying what you now know. This duality becomes even more complicated when turned inward, because enlightenment also brings the realization that even the self is not fixed, that your identity is fluid, that your mind is not a reliable narrator. You begin to see the ways your ego still sneaks in. Even in your highest moments, you catch your motives, question your impulses, reflect endlessly, and that too becomes isolating, not from others, but from yourself. You wonder, can I trust who I am? Is this voice mine, or just another mask? In seeking to understand everything, have I forgotten how to simply be? This is the trap of hyper-awareness. The more you reflect, the more mirrors you create, until even your own reflection becomes suspect. And so the duality deepens. You are both the observer and the observed, the seeker and the doubter, the awakened one and the one who quietly longs to fall asleep again. Philosophers have written about this paradox for centuries. Kierkegaard spoke of the sickness unto death, the despair that comes from being conscious of oneself, and yet unable to reconcile that self with the world. Camus wrote of the absurd, the conflict between our desire for meaning and the silent indifference of the universe. These aren't academic ideas. They're lived experiences for those who've peeled back the layers of reality and found no stable ground beneath. And so the question emerges, can these two sides, self-awareness and social disconnection, ever truly be reconciled? Can we be fully awake and still feel at home in a world that sleeps? Can we carry the weight of perception and still find peace in the ordinary? The answer may not be absolute. Perhaps it isn't about reconciliation in the traditional sense. Perhaps it's about learning to hold both truths at once, the beauty of clarity and the pain of distance, to stop trying to merge them and instead to walk with them side by side, to live with contradiction. To speak truth even when misunderstood, to love others even when you feel unseen, to honor solitude without letting it harden into isolation. The enlightened mind may never fully return to the simplicity it once knew, but it can find a new kind of belonging, not in crowds, not in conformity, but in quiet understanding, in the rare and precious moments when to awakened souls recognize each other across the void, and know, if only for a moment, that they are not alone. In a world where information is abundant, but truth is elusive, the act of thinking deeply has become a kind of rebellion, and like all rebellions, it comes with a cost. The enlightened mind, far from being celebrated, is often marginalized, not because it is wrong, but because it is inconvenient to systems built not on truth, but on control, conformity, and distraction. Society, for all its complexity, is held together by a fragile architecture of consensus, not a consensus of facts, but of comfort. Most people don't want to know the full truth of their condition. They want narratives that make life manageable, predictable, survivable, and so systems evolve not to encourage insight, but to suppress it. This begins with the most dominant system of our time, capitalism. On the surface, capitalism sells freedom, the freedom to buy, to sell, to choose. But beneath that surface, it creates a psychological terrain that discourages introspection. Everything becomes commodified, even identity. Your value is measured not by your depth of thought, but by your productivity, your efficiency, your ability to adapt to market needs. In this environment, enlightenment becomes a liability. A distraction. It makes you pause when the system wants you to move. It makes you question when the system wants you to consume. Those who think too much often struggle to fit in, not because they are flawed, but because the system is not designed for minds that seek depth. It is designed for minds that obey. And when deep thinkers challenge this structure, they are not debated. They are dismissed. They are labeled as fringe, as radical, as conspiracy theorists. The label itself is a weapon, not aimed at disproving the idea, but at discrediting the person. The moment you step outside the consensus, your credibility is revoked, and with it, your connection to society. Take Edward Snowden. He revealed a global surveillance apparatus that violated basic human rights. And instead of being lauded for his courage, he was exiled. His message, too dangerous for the mainstream, had to be buried beneath character attacks and legal threats. Or Julian Assange, who exposed war crimes and the hypocrisy of world powers. He was not imprisoned for lying, but for telling the truth. And in doing so, he became a warning. This is what happens when you shine a light too bright. But the persecution of critical thinkers is not limited to whistleblowers. It happens in classrooms, where students are punished for asking the wrong kinds of questions. It happens in workplaces, where employees are silenced for questioning unethical practices. It happens in media, where dissenting voices are algorithmically buried or demonetized into silence. These mechanisms are not accidental, they are systemic. Because critical thinking disrupts the flow of the machine. It slows consumption. It challenges authority. It undermines profit. And so, society develops antibodies, cultural, legal, technological, to isolate the enlightened, to neutralize their influence. Social media, which once promised open dialogue, has become one of the most insidious enforcers of conformity. Platforms that claim to connect us are, in truth, designed to polarize us, to addict us, to keep us reactive and emotionally manipulated. The architecture of these systems rewards outrage, not inquiry; virality, not truth; simplification, not nuance. And when someone dares to explore an idea too deeply, especially one that threatens the status quo, the system responds not with curiosity, but with suspicion. The thinker becomes the outsider. The conversation becomes a controversy. The algorithm becomes a wall. This is how enlightenment becomes isolation. Not because the enlightened reject society, but because society rejects them. It fears what they represent: disruption, disobedience, depth, the uncomfortable truths that lie beneath our rituals and routines. It is easier, safer, to exile these voices than to face what they are trying to reveal. And yet, these systems are so pervasive, so omnipresent, that even those who awaken often find themselves caught in their web. They still scroll, still perform, still shrink themselves to be heard, because they know to speak freely is to risk invisibility, or worse, attack. This creates a climate of intellectual suppression so subtle that most don't even notice it. But the enlightened do. They feel it in the hesitations before they speak, in the silence that follows their questions, in the loneliness that grows when they refuse to pretend. And so they withdraw, not because they want to, but because they must. They seek solitude not as escapism, but as protection from the noise, from the conditioning, from the constant demand to conform. In that solitude, they may find peace, but they also find grief. Grief for a world that punishes thought, that ridicules depth, that rewards performance over authenticity. Grief for the connections lost, the conversations that never happen, the bridges that cannot be built. But even in that grief, there is something unbreakable: integrity. To think deeply, to question loudly, to remain honest in a dishonest world. This is a form of quiet resistance. The systems may isolate you, but they cannot own you. And in a culture where everything is for sale, to preserve the sovereignty of your mind is a revolutionary act. The enlightened mind walks a hard path, but it is not a meaningless one, because every suppressed idea eventually finds its voice, every exile eventually finds a community, and every system, no matter how powerful, eventually cracks under the weight of its own denial. Until then, the lonely must keep thinking, keep questioning, keep witnessing, because if no one holds the line of truth, who will? The loneliness of the enlightened is not a flaw. It is a symptom of a sick society. But it is also a signal that something real, something vital, still lives beneath the surface. And that, perhaps, is where hope begins. At some point, every enlightened mind reaches the edge of a cliff, the place where all familiar meanings dissolve, where all comforting illusions burn away. And what lies beyond is not clarity, not peace, but the vast, unsettling silence of the void. This is the existential crisis, the moment when knowledge becomes too heavy, when truth no longer illuminates, but instead exposes the terrifying possibility that nothing matters, that our thoughts, our actions, our very lives are fragments adrift in a universe that offers no answers, no direction, no inherent meaning for those who walk the path of awakening. This confrontation is almost inevitable. They begin by questioning the world, its systems, its structures, its histories. But soon, those questions turn inward. What is the self? What is the purpose? If society is built on illusions, then what isn't? And if nothing is real, then what's the point of trying? This descent into doubt is not weakness. It is the byproduct of courage, of having gone deeper than most dare to go. But the cost is high. As illusions fall, so does the scaffolding that held one's identity in place, the job titles, the belief systems, the moral codes, once reliable anchors, start to feel arbitrary, and beneath them, there's nothing but the raw awareness of mortality, uncertainty, and cosmic indifference. Camus called this the absurd, the tension between our search for meaning and the universe's silence. He said that once we recognize this absurdity, we face a choice: suicide or revolt. Not just physical suicide, but philosophical suicide, a retreat into religion, ideology, or distraction, or revolt, the choice to live fully despite the meaninglessness, to embrace the void and still create. Sartre, too, wrestled with this darkness. For him, the absence of inherent meaning was not a tragedy, but a liberation. If nothing is predetermined, then everything becomes possible. We are condemned to be free, he said, and that freedom is terrifying, because it means there's no higher authority to guide us, no blueprint, no final answer, only choices, each one echoing in the emptiness, each one shaping a self that is always unfinished. This is the heart of the crisis, to know that nothing matters and still care. To see the futility of it all, and still create. To feel alone in a world that cannot understand you, and still reach for connection. Many cannot do this. The void swallows them, not in a single moment, but slowly, through quiet apathy, through numb routines, through the soft erosion of hope. Depression sets in, not as sadness, but as weight, a dull gravity that makes even breathing feel like labor. The enlightened mind, so full of insight, begins to question its own value. What's the point of understanding if no one wants to? Here, what's the point of seeing clearly if nothing changes? What's the point of being awake if the world keeps dreaming? And yet, this despair, this confrontation with the void, is also where something transformative can begin. Because when you realize that nothing has inherent meaning, you are no longer bound by inherited meanings. You are free to choose, to define, to create values rooted not in authority, but in authenticity. This is the second awakening. The first reveals the illusions. The second invites you to live without them, not bitterly, not cynically, but bravely. To find beauty not in permanence, but in presence. To find purpose not in some grand cosmic design, but in the act of living honestly, even when no one is watching. To give your thoughts and actions meaning, because you choose to, not because the world demands it. And that choice, made in the face of meaninglessness, is the essence of empowerment, because it is the only form of meaning that cannot be taken from you. It is not bestowed, it is claimed. The existential crisis is not a dead end. It is a threshold, a reckoning that burns away everything false so that you can begin again, not with certainty, but with clarity, not with answers, but with honesty. And in that space, the enlightened mind can move forward, not healed, not whole, but awake. Awake to the void, and awake to the miracle of existing in spite of it. To live without meaning, and still choose love. To live without certainty, and still seek truth. To live without belonging, and still offer connection. This is not despair. It is defiance, and maybe, just maybe, it's where a new kind of peace begins. Not the peace of resolution, but the peace of resilience, the peace of one who has faced the void and walked through it. There is a paradox buried in the heart of human progress that often the ones who move the world forward are not those most accepted by it, but those cast out by it. The prophets, the visionaries, the rebels, the misfits, they are rarely found in the center of society's circle. They are found on the edges, watching from a distance, speaking truths no one wants to hear. To be disconnected is to be free, and in that freedom, the outcast discovers a power no institution can grant, and no crowd can validate, the power to see without filters, to think without constraints, and to act without permission. The loneliness of the enlightened mind is not simply a condition, it is a crucible, one that forges clarity, depth, and originality. And though it may isolate, it also liberates. Albert Einstein once said, "The monotony of a quiet life stimulates the creative mind." He lived much of his life as an outsider, an immigrant, a pacifist in times of war, a thinker who challenged the Newtonian world with ideas so abstract, so counterintuitive, that even his peers struggled to understand him at first. But from that solitude emerged a new vision of reality, one that bent space and time and reshaped the way we see the universe. Isaac Newton, too, made his most important discoveries during a time of personal and social isolation. During the Great Plague, while universities shut down and cities were paralyzed, Newton retreated to his family home, alone, in silence, with no one to impress and no system to obey. He developed the foundations of calculus, optics, and the laws of motion, the very architecture of the modern scientific worldview. And yet, it's not only the old masters. Even today, we witness how disconnection can give birth to influence. Greta Thunberg began as a solitary figure, striking from school alone, sitting on the steps of the Swedish parliament with a simple sign. Her clarity did not come from consensus, but from conviction, a conviction so sharp it cut through political theater and media noise. Many mocked her. Some dismissed her as naive, others as a threat. But she was unafraid, precisely because she had already accepted her position outside the comfortable circle of conformity. And in that rejection, she found her voice. What unites these figures is not just brilliance, but alienation, and a willingness to turn that alienation into impact. Because to be free from society's illusions is to be free to challenge them. While the majority are tangled in systems of approval, chasing likes, promotions, applause, the outcast sees the architecture of these systems for what they are: fragile constructs built to maintain control and resist change. And in stepping outside them, they are able to imagine something else entirely. But this power comes with pain. The outcast is not immune to loneliness. They are often haunted by it. They feel the sting of disconnection, the absence of community, the ache of being misunderstood. They are told they are too much, too intense, too serious, too strange. They walk through life carrying truths that others are not ready for, and often they must carry them alone. But perhaps that is the price of vision, to stand apart, so that others may one day see. Carl Jung wrote that the individual who goes his own way inevitably meets with loneliness. But the more he is true to himself, the more he becomes what he is meant to be. This is not romantic idealism. It is the harsh, necessary terrain of transformation. To become what you are meant to be often means leaving behind who the world expects you to be. And in that shedding, the enlightened mind becomes more than an observer. It becomes a catalyst. The outcast becomes the artist who reimagines culture, the philosopher who redefines meaning, the activist who reclaims justice, the scientist who redrafts reality. And though their path is solitary, its impact is collective. Their isolation creates echoes, ripples, movements, paradigms. They may never be fully embraced in their lifetime, but their ideas, forged in the fire of loneliness, outlive them, and sometimes change the very societies that once rejected them. But there is something deeper still, beyond the accolades, beyond the influence. There is the quiet redemption of integrity, of living in alignment with one's truth, even when that truth isolates you. especially when it does. Because in a world that sells conformity as belonging, the outcast reminds us that authenticity is its own kind of home. They teach us that loneliness is not always a void to be filled, but a space to be honored, a space where the self is not diluted, but distilled. In that silence, in that exile, the enlightened mind does not die. It becomes sharper, quieter, braver. It learns to stop performing. It learns to endure misunderstanding without resentment. It learns to build a life not on validation, but on vision. And perhaps, in time, it finds others, not many, but enough, kindred minds who have also walked through the fire, who have also seen too much to go back. Together, not in a crowd, but in a constellation, distant stars aligned not by proximity, but by perspective. So we return to the question, can true change only come from those willing to face the loneliness of enlightenment? Maybe, because it is only when we leave the known, the accepted, the celebrated, that we see the structures we are meant to challenge, the illusions we are meant to dismantle, and the future we are meant to build. The outcast is not broken. They are becoming. They are the ones who dare to step outside the dream, and in doing so, plant the seeds of awakening for those still asleep. And perhaps that is the final truth, that the loneliness of the enlightened mind is not a punishment, but a calling, not a curse, but a crucible. And in that crucible, the mind is not destroyed. It is reborn. As we reach the end of this journey, we are left with an uncomfortable, yet undeniable truth. The loneliness of the enlightened mind is not an accident. It is not an unfortunate byproduct of awakening. It is, in fact, an integral part of the path itself. To see beyond the surface, to pierce the veil of illusion and confront the raw, unembellished truth of existence, is to separate oneself from the very fabric of society. The world, built on comforts, distractions, and accepted norms, cannot hold space for those who choose to question it too deeply. To awaken is, in a way, to become an outsider, one whose intellectual vision, though profound, comes at the cost of connection. The more you know, the less you belong. But this loneliness, this isolation, should not be seen as a curse to be avoided, but as a necessary burden, a transformative crucible. It is a trial, yes, but it is also an opportunity. In isolation, the enlightened mind is forced to grow, to evolve, and to shed the illusions that most people cling to. It is here, in the silence, that clarity emerges. The question then is not whether this loneliness is avoidable, it's whether the enlightened mind can transcend it. Can it use this solitude as a catalyst for personal and societal transformation? Can isolation become the birthplace of new ideas, new ways of thinking, new ways of being? The enlightened mind must not succumb to despair. It cannot retreat into passivity, nursing its wounds while the world moves on. The burden of knowing must be wielded, not as a weapon of bitterness, but as a tool for change. The enlightenment gained must serve not only the individual, but the collective. The isolation felt must be transformed from a source of suffering into a wellspring of creation. To walk this path is to embrace a paradox, that enlightenment, though not a road to happiness, is a road to truth. And truth, once known, must not be buried under the weight of despair. It must be shared, even if it is shared alone. This is the challenge for those who awaken, to use their understanding to disrupt the world, to guide others, to build connections not from conformity, but from radical honesty. The enlightened mind is a lantern in the darkness. It may shine brightly, but its glow can only reach others if it dares to burn through the night, even in isolation. In the end, the loneliness of the enlightened mind is not a punishment. It is a necessary burden, one that, when carried with purpose and courage, can change the world. And perhaps, in the end, that is the greatest gift the enlightened can offer, not a retreat from the world, but the strength to stand apart, to think critically, and to challenge the status quo, to walk the path of truth, even when it means walking alone.